Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum. I'm here again with lecture number 2 of the subject 19th century poetry. And the topic of today's discussion is salient features of 19th century poetry. Okay, let's start our lecture. Here we have the lecture outline. I'll discuss salient features of the age and I'll conclude, and then there will be references here in this lecture. Okay, starting with salient features of the age. We have different features. For example, experimentation with poetic form. The poets of this age, they have experimented with the poetic form. We will be studying about these features in detail in our later slides. Nature, ruins and relics of the ancient past. The poet of this age had a love for the ruins and relics of the ancient past. We'll also be looking into the detail of this feature later on. Yes, rebellion. Poets of this age were rebellious as well. I'll prove this with examples. Then heroism is one of the features of this age. Emotion, sense and sensuality. All right. Sublime, yeah, or sublimity, like sublimity of the feature of this age means sublimity of the work of this age. The French Revolution and Industrial Revolution, these are the main, or you can say the salient features of this age. Yes, starting with experimentation with poetic form. What the early romantics, especially William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge, wanted to do was revolutionize the way poetry was written. They wanted poetry to be written on such patterns that was unconventional, means the themes, the pattern, the poetic style which was used for composing or writing the poetry in 15th or 16th century, they actually deviated from that style, that form, that type of themes which were used at that time, and they brought something new into the poetry, and that new was related to nature, you can say. Like theme wise it was related to the nature, poetic form, poetry wise, and the there was rhyme scheme in the poetry. So these were the poetic forms that were used here in romantic era and in the 19th century poetry. They set out to write poems that use the language of ordinary speech. They use such language which was the language of the common people. Instead of using the language of aristocratic class, instead of using the language that had literary value, they use such language as was used by the common man, but which were still beautiful and poetic. They had the poetic characteristics in that language, and the language which was beautiful, which was colloquial. All right. Its example include William Wordsworth's "I wandered lonely as a cloud" from the poem that is from Daffodils. All right. Samuel Taylor Coleridge also liked to play around with poetic conventions. See how he varies line lengths to create new effects in his poem Kubla Khan. In this poem, he has used certain conventions. They are also called as poetic convention that he had used. He had varied the line, or you can say the lengths, to create new effect in his poem Kubla Khan. Previously, the verses, the length of the verses, they were different, but he had used differently. All right, they were like sometimes they were used. They were the small verse, then there was a large verse, you can say. But here he had used small with large, small with large. So there were alternative verse length used in his poems, in his poem Kubla Khan. Number 2, the feature of romantics is nature. For romantics, although I have also discussed it in my previous lectures, so here we will discuss it in detail, that romantics had a great love for the nature. They were such kind of poets who had who consider nature everything. For example, for Wordsworth, nature was kind of nature had different functions. Like at times nature can become a sister. She had such affection. You feel like being pampered, being cared by like a nature. All right, you feel if you talk about St. Coleridge, he talk about supernaturalism in the nature, something that is not of this world, something that is beyond the powers of this world. All right, if we talk about Shelley, he saw a power in a nature. So different poets had their different appeals, their different perspectives, perception, particularly about the nature. The Romantics had a huge crush on nature. Yes, crush. They were just fond of nature. They were just crazy about the nature. They whatever they thought, whatever they wrote at that time, it was related to the nature. These guys, and sometimes girls means girls, loved trees, flowers, mountains, clouds, crags, birds, you name it, whatever you name, whatever part of nature you want to name it, they had used them in their poetry. They had used such elements in their poetry. They have beautified their poetry by the use of such natural things, natural elements, natural themes. As long as it was outdoors, they loved it. Okay, when these things, for example, if Wordsworth is sitting near his window and he's looking the clouds outside on the sky, then he'll start thinking about the cloud, that if he was a cloud, so if he were a cloud, so what would have been his life, how he would have floated from one place to another, he had moved around it. So he feels himself to be a part of nature and consider himself to be that part of nature, and then he wanted to experience the things that those nature elements would have felt. So that was basically the concept of Wordsworth. If we went to the Romantics with a diagnosis of depression, they would tell us, forget meds mean medicines, take a walk in the park, hug a tree, talk to a bird, all you need is a little green. Okay, when you if suppose that you go to the Romantics, all right, and you are suffering from some kind of depression and you want Romantics, and you have shared your depression with them, what they will say, they'll say, okay, instead of taking medicines, just go to the nature, just have view of greenery, just hug a tree, just uh, just tell everything to the nature, the way you are experiencing, the way you are feeling, whether you are feeling sad, you are feeling happiness, go to the nature, tell it to the nature, you will feel relaxed. Okay, so nature had that much role in the lives of Romantic poets. For example, Percy Bysshe Shelley's poem Ode to the West Wind, imagining himself as a leaf carried by the wind. So can you imagine someone considering himself to be a leaf that is carried by the wind? So Percy Bysshe Shelley's poem, that Ode to the West Wind, that we also had this poem in our course, we will study it in later classes, and he imagined himself to be as a leaf. All right, so this was the concept, this was the concept that they had of the nature in their mind, and they used such natural elements for the imagination. Ruins and relics of the ancient past. Yes, poets of this age had this kind of perspective of the past, that they used to stay in the past. If we talk about such concept here in present, so people would think that you are such a mad person to live in the past and have the recollections of the past. But people of Romantic age, particularly the poets, they were more happy having the recollected memories of the past. They like to sit hunched over, clothes all disheveled, chin on hand, frowning and thinking about time. Just consider that you are sitting on your couch and you have a chin, you have a hand under your chin, and you sit idly. Means you are sitting by doing nothing, and you just start pondering over the things. You just consider time. You just talk about the nature. You just keep on thinking. You are lost in your thought. This is what they used to do. How quickly it goes by, how mysterious it is. Got that picture in your head? So yeah, it's not surprising that these guys loved them some ruins. So they just think how quickly the good time had passed, how mysterious it was. All right. So this kind of picture they had in their mind, ruins and relics of the ancient past. They were very fond of such things, and they wanted to have it applied in their poetry. This example, and we found it. We find its example in John Keats' ode on Ancient Urn. Ancient Urn was basically a vase having relics of the ancient Greek, like it was a pastoral life of ancient Greek that was engraved on the vase, and he wrote poem over it, that how the life would have been at that time, but just looking at the vase, how it, things were, how the life was engraved on it, the people, the tree, the natural things. So he wrote poem over it. Rebellion. Yes, they were rebels. They were not conformists. Conformists mean the one who is stick to the traditions, culture, values, conventions, means stick to the already existing set patterns, the stereotypes. They do not. They were not in favor of such uh, blind following of traditions. Rather, the Romantics did not want to be. Okay, the Romantics weren't conformists. The Romantics did not want to be constrained by social, literary, or political conventions. They did not want someone to be, want to follow the social system, the literary, the literary rules, the binding that the literature impose on you, that you have to follow the strict rhyme scheme, you have to follow the strict verse, that was considered standard. So they deviated from all such conventions and the political conventions as well. Like previously, poetry was written on such subjects of the kings and the queens, but they do not stick to that. Rather, they started writing poems on such topics which were, subjects of the common man, like, and the subjects of the worldly affairs, like nature, the beauty, music. They wrote on such element, the wind even. They believed above all as else in being true to their own individuality. What they believed was their own individuality. They believed that they had their own life, they had their own distinction, so they wanted to present their distinction. For example, William Blake showing up the awful conditions of London in the late 1700s in his poem London. So William Blake has shown up like how awful the London condition was in late 1700. Okay, heroism in is another characteristics. Don Juan, Prometheus, Frankenstein's monster. These are all heroes who were made famous by the Romantics. So Romantics are such people, like Romantic poets are such people who had made life, or the heroes immortal. That they have talked about few people who had become famous because of their writings. They had presented them in such a way that they had become famous. The Romantics were great at creating larger than life and unforgettable heroes. For example, the Ancient Mariner in Samuel Taylor Coleridge's poem The Rime of the Ancient Mariner. Yes, the Ancient Mariner is a character in his poem who had become immortal. We can also find Ancient Mariner these days as well. So this is some kind of heroism that we find in the poetry of Romantic era. Emotion. Yes, Romantics were highly sentimental. They talked about the emotions, they talked about the feelings, how one person is feeling. If you are sad, so what is the reason behind it? When you are sad, how you feel. They talked about such subjects. Similarly, if you are happy, so what is the thing that makes you happy? They talked about such things. They were, along with being emotional, they were also sensitive. Like even a flower could move them to tears if they looked at the flower that had been plucked by someone. So they'll feel that how the flower would have felt by being plucked out from its stem. So how it would have been feeling. That they used to consider those emotions, they used to consider those situations. As a result, they became sensitive and then highly sentimental. An old Greek urn could set them brooding for hours, and they can also use to lost in their imaginations by just simply looking at a vase that was Greek, Grecian urn. These writers were flat out obsessed with feelings, and these writers were literally obsessed with the feelings that whatever they were obsessed with the feelings of love, they were obsessed with the feelings of joy, they were obsessed with the feelings of sadness. Okay, in fact, one of the most famous definitions of poetry is the one that William Wordsworth, the father of British Romanticism, gave us. That he said that poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. It takes its origin from emotion recollected in tranquility. It means, like, you just, for example, if I am sitting here, so I start recollecting on something, and if I have some kind of feelings, and there is a spontaneous overflow of such feelings, all right. William Wordsworth poetry line composed a few miles above Tinton Abbey on revisiting the banks of the Wye during a tour July 13, 1798. Okay, William Wordsworth's poetry had such element, and his lines which are composed a few miles above Tinton Abbey. It is a place in England. So few lines which he composed by sitting, or by having sitting, you can say, few miles above Tinton Abbey, and like on revisiting the banks of Wye during a tour. So this is an example of highly sentimental poetry. Sense and sensuality. Okay, tons of sensory detail are found when we read romantic writings. Lots of sounds and sights and smells and tastes. So we find such things in the things which appeal to our senses are called as sensuousness. So that is one of the characteristics of, you can say, the feature of this romantic era. The romantics are really into apprehending the world through the five senses. They apprehend the world through the five senses. Five senses means, the sense of sight, sense of hearing, sense of touch, sense of smell, and sense of taste. So William Wordsworth, I wandered lonely as a cloud, daffodils, in which the speaker describes a beautiful sea of daffodils. So you just feel like watching the daffodils in reality by reading just the poetry. This is how your senses are evoked. This is what we call as sensuous poetry. Similarly, in Ode on a Grecian urn, Keats he said that heard melodies are sweet and those unheard are sweeter. That also create the sense of sensuality. Okay, sublime. This poetry is sublime. According to the romantics, we experience the sublime when we are out in nature. Sublime means something which is extraordinary, something which is magnificent, which is grand. All right, so we experience something grand by reading the poetry of the romantics. When we are out in nature, but not just any nature, we have to be facing nature at its grandest, its most awe-inspiring. Yes, we do not look at the nature the way we look at the nature these days. When we read romantic poetry, we had some different perspective of nature, the perspective from which we had never viewed nature. All right, so this is something amazing about this poetry. Think big mountains, crazy deep valleys, a huge thunderstorm with lightning striking everywhere. So just imagine such power of the nature, such magnanimity of the nature which we do not even imagine. Okay, William Wordsworth poetry, that lines composed a few miles above Tinton Abbey, again that comes in. It can also serve as example. I have already explained this example, so let's move on. Yes, next point is the French Revolution. The French Revolution had huge repercussions not only in France but all over Europe. Repercussions mean having side effects. So French Revolution traumatized not only the France but the Europe as well. It was the first time that the aristocracy had been brought down, and Marie Antoinette and her husband Louis the 16 had their heads gluttoned off. Yes, what happened that it was the first time when the upper class, particularly the aristocracy, they had been brought down, and there was a revolt against them, and people forced them out of their palace. The king and the queen had to flee from that place. So people were talking about liberty, equality, and fraternity. It means liberty, equality, and fraternity. That was the slogan of the French Revolutions. We also find themes of French Revolution in this romantic era as well. In other words, it was a time of huge social and political transformation. Yes, there occurred social and political change, which was pretty inspiring to the romantics, who, as we might remember, valued individuality and freedom and rebelled against social and literary conventions of their age. Yes, romantics, they had, although they had their own individuality, but they do not conform to the traditions. Rather, they had their own, they rebelled against social and literary conventions of their day. William Blake, describing more of the terrible conditions that the French Revolution reacted against, it's about a little boy who is a chimney sweeper, and it's called the chimney sweeper. So we have a manifestation of the repercussions of French Revolution in the poem The Chimney Sweeper by William Blake. The Industrial Revolution, yes, that was also famous phenomena or revolution in at that age. The Industrial Revolution, like the French Revolution, was bringing about lots of changes at the time that the Romantic poets began writing. So it brought changes when the Romantic poets started writing. All right. So what kind of change? Like industry was flourishing. There were different scientific and technological developments underway. So these were the things that industrial revolutionaries brought, and as a result it had impact on the writings of this age. More and more people were moving to the cities to work in factories. New manufacturing processes were being put in place, and people were moving further and further away from the nature. What happened as a result of the factory? The people started migrating from the rural areas, started shifting, settling in the urban areas, and as a result they moved away from the nature. Yes, its example is found in John Keats' poem, that is Ode to a Nightingale, which reflects how miserable people were, because Keats himself wanted to have a life of nightingale, because life full of freedom, life without any suffering. So he wanted to have such kind of freedom and suffering which was away from, or the thing which was non-existent in industrial world. Okay, so the features of 19th century poetry make it distinct from other types of poetry. Yes, because the poets rebelled against against the social and political structures. They had their own individuality. That is why there is distinction in the characteristics of this poetry from the other types of poetry. The experimentation with the poetic form, nature, ruins and relics of the ancient past, rebellion, heroism, emotion, sense and sensuality, sublimity, the French Revolution, the Industrial Revolution are important features of 19th century. Alright, so that's all for today's lecture, and hopefully you have understood it well.